there is sort of an eerie parallel. And you have to be extremely careful drawing such parallels and such connections to this unexplainable war that is World War II. But is there elements of this that do echo in the actions of Vladimir Putin? And more specifically, do you think that Vladimir Putin is a war criminal? Can that label be assigned to the actions of this man?
So, war criminal is a legal determination, and it requires evidence and due process and the ability to defend oneself. We don't just decide in the Twitter sphere or on a podcast that somebody is a war criminal. They can be a suspected war criminal, and we can gather evidence to try to prosecute that case. And then the issue for us, Lex, is which court does it go to? What's the appropriate place? Does it happen in Ukraine because they're the victims? Does it happen in The Hague because there's an international criminal court there? Does it happen inside Russia because there's regime change at some point and some of these people become, let's say, they get arrested by their own people inside Russia? So those are all important questions that have to be pursued with resources and with determination and by skilled people who are excellent at gathering that evidence. And that process is underway. And Ukraine has a trial underway now of one alleged war criminal who's pleaded guilty, and we'll see what the outcome of that trial inside Ukraine is, of a lower level official, not obviously Vladimir Putin, but the commander of a tank group. So, yes, the names are eerily familiar. Izium, Kharkiv, Kiev, right? Those are the names we know from the Nazi invasion and the Nazi occupation of Ukraine. And it's very deeply troubling to think that this could happen again. And there's a bizarre sense that the Russians, claiming, as Putin says, to denazify Ukraine, have invaded the same places that the Nazis invaded back in 1941.
As somebody who's working on volume 3 of your work on Stalin, going through this period, is it eerie to you?
Yes, it is, Lex.
That you're...
I've written the chapters of volume 3. I've drafted the chapters on the war. And as I said, the place names are very evocative, unfortunately. But you know, the Nazis failed ultimately. They captured Ukraine for a time, but they were evicted from Ukraine. And there was massive partisan or guerrilla warfare resistance behind Nazi lines the whole time that they were allegedly in control of Ukraine. If you look at the maps on cable TV, they show you the sign of Russia, they show you the coloring, Russian control, and they draw a line and then it's colored in. But the word control is misplaced. They don't actually control it. It's Russian claimed or extent of farthest Russian troop advancement. Because behind the Russian lines in Ukraine, Crimea excepted, you have insurgencies. You have the armed insurgency. In Melitopol, for example, which is a place that you know, in southeastern Ukraine, there is a guerrilla war now underway to hurt the Russians who are in occupation of that city and region. And we're going to see that continue, even if the war becomes a stalemate, even if it stalemates more or less at the lines we're at now, which would mean that anticipated Ukrainian counteroffensive at scale proves unsuccessful, the Russian army doesn't disintegrate, and you end up with a stalemate where there could be a ceasefire or not a ceasefire, but neither side is attempting an offensive for the time being. There will be resistance behind those Russian lines, and it will be fierce resistance, the kind of resistance we saw to the Nazi occupation. Ultimately, it took the Red Army reinvading the territory of Ukraine and succeeding at combined arms operations at scale. A massive counteroffensive, much larger than anything we're talking about today. Ultimately, it required that to evict the Nazis from Ukraine. But in the meantime, they did not have an easy occupation regime there. Ukrainian partisans, Soviet partisans, killed Nazi officials, Wehrmacht soldiers, Wehrmacht officers, blew up the infrastructure they were using, made them pay a price for their occupation. We could well see, if unfortunately this ends in a stalemate for the time being, we could well see that type of insurgency gain momentum behind Russian lines and try to evict the Russians that way, and then remount the counteroffensive at scale later on in the future if the first one doesn't succeed. So that would be further echoes of the World War II experience. The scale, once again, is much smaller. The size of the armies here, they're not in the many hundred, 800,000, 700,000, 1,000,002, 1,000,004. That's not what we're talking about today. But the weapons, the cruise missiles, right? Artillery fire. You know, artillery fire used to be very inaccurate, and it was like saturation.
Mm-hmm.
You would just fire towards the enemy lines, and if you hit something, you hit something, and if you didn't, you just kept firing. Now you have drones, Lex. And so artillery fire is now sniper fire, because you can coordinate the direction of the artillery fire with the drones. The drones can take a picture and show you where the enemy is precisely located. And you can align that artillery to hit them instead of just indiscriminately bombing an area, a territory. And the NATO-supplied artillery goes really far. And you can fire into Russian positions and yourself not be exposed to Russian fire because your artillery fires farther than theirs. So that's coming. And we're going to see that in action. And so the scale is not the same, but the weapons, the precision of some of the weapons and some of the NATO, we're not sending all of our stuff. But as I said, the dynamic is Russia commits atrocities, Russia bombs schools, Russia bombs hospitals, Russia kills civilians, and more and heavier and more lethal Western weapons go to Ukraine. Their willingness to risk their lives is really so impressive, and the reason that it's our duty. We're obliged to supply those weapons. And so the Russians don't have that resupply, and the Ukrainians do. And so the Russians are now digging in, Lex. They're digging in deeply in the areas that they've penetrated. And they're trying to build unassailable positions when the Ukrainians transition from mostly defense to full-scale offense. And we'll see if that now, I mean, they're digging everywhere, you know, as they say, kapayut, right? They're digging everywhere behind.
Your Russian is beautiful.
Digging in. Yes. I wish, Lex, like yours. But so there are these things that we can't predict, but there are these things we're watching and watching closely.
And on top of that, something that's not in World War II, or for the most part, is cyber attacks and cyber warfare, which is much less, perhaps, convertible into human words because it happens so quickly at such large scales, so difficult to trace and all those kinds of things. It's not bullets, it's electrical signals. And that.
Yeah, but those Ukrainian people, they're like you, Lex. They're young. And they're technically really proficient.
Yeah.
And they've been amazing. You know, they spent those teenage years in the basement playing video games. Not that
Turns out it's useful after all.
it turns out it's more than useful. You can save your country that way. And so they're not alone. They're getting support, and that support is important. But really, predominantly, it's Ukrainians on the cyber battlefield, and their skills have been very impressive, and they've been preparing for this for a number of years. And they have a whole army of young people on the cyber side. It's their civilian population. These are not people conscripted into the military or volunteering, wearing the uniform. And so even in cyber warfare, the Ukrainians have been extremely impressive. And so let's remember that all of these aspects of warfare, whether it's how far your cruise missiles go and how accurate they are, what size your cyber capabilities are, and it's really ultimately about the people. It's about the human capital, right? It's about their willingness, their skill level, but also their willingness to fight and to put their lives on the line. And there's no substitute for that. And so what's called morale or courage or bravery or valor, that's really the ultimately decisive, provided you have enough sufficient arms, right, to conduct the fight. And if you don't, you use a Molotov cocktail, right? Grandma calls in the coordinates of the Russian tank on her iPhone, and you have a Molotov cocktail that the people who used to work in the cafeteria are now stuffing flammable liquid into bottles, and you carry one right up to the tank and you smash it against the tank, or you drop it in one of the hatches in the tank, right? There's no substitute for that kind of stuff, that level of resolve, willingness to die for your country. That's a really big lesson that we need to absorb in our own country. We've been going to war more frequently than we should. And like you said, without the justification all the time. And then like Henry Kissinger said, without understanding how this was going to end. It's easy to start a war. It's very difficult to win a war, prevail in a war, or end a war on terms that meet your original expectations, right? We've been fighting wars, but we haven't been fighting wars as societies. We've been fighting wars as a small sliver of our population. Something like 1% of our population is involved with the military because we have an all-volunteer force. And that means that it's easier for our politicians to go to war because they don't face conscription. They don't have the draft, which affects every family in the country. And because the number of people in the volunteer force is such a narrow stratum of the population. And so they've been getting away with this because the professional army is much better than the conscript army. And an all-volunteer force is much preferable from a military point of view. But from a societal point of view, it enables you to go to war too easily as a politician, and it doesn't engage the society the same way that the Ukrainian society is completely engaged, from those young hackers all the way up to those grandmothers.